In 1876, the Canadian government passed the Indian Act, aimed at assimilating the country's Indigenous population. As part of this mission, the country established residential schools. During one of Canada's darker chapters, generations of Indigenous children were taken away from their families and communities to be placed in these schools. Funded by the Department of Indian Affairs but administered by Christian churches, the residential schools operated in Canada up until 1996 when the last one was closed. These schools have had extremely disruptive impacts on the emotional, social, and cultural lives of the children, and continue to have tragic impacts in the lives of survivors and their families. In this video, I will use concepts from James Scott's book, Seeing Like a State, to provide insight into some of the reasons the Canadian government pursued the policy of residential schools. In Part 1, Scott examines different ways that states measure, categorize, and simplify citizen populations in order to make them legible, and therefore easier to monitor, count, assess, and manage. I will apply ideas specifically from Chapter 2 about the role of language in state consolidation and how this relates to residential schools. My argument is that Scott's concept about the importance of state linguistic consolidation in order to homogenize and manage its citizens helps to explain why the Canadian government put Indigenous children in residential schools where they were prohibited from speaking their native tongues. First, what were these schools like? In order to provide a picture of life in these schools, these are the accounts of two survivors.
Residential schools are schools that were set up by the government of Canada, and there are other countries that have the same thing, but it was a policy that was put into place to bring as many Indigenous people as possible into these schools, to educate them into the European way of life, to take you away from your culture, your language, all your traditions, and that's what it's about.
We weren't allowed to talk in our language. We had to speak English, but it wasn't indoctrination. Like, they didn't put us in one room and indoctrinate us all day long or anything like that. It's just the way, the routine of the place. It was in the routine that you didn't speak anything but English. You went to white man's school. You went to white man's church. You wore the white man's clothes.
In order to sever those ties in your culture and your language, they had to separate children from families and communities. We wore uniforms, you all dressed the same, you had your hair cut the same, you were all one.
Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. Duncan Campbell Scott, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, January 1st, 1920.
They learn not only games and traditions, such as the celebration of St. Valentine's Day, but the mastery of words, which will open to them the whole range of the ordinary Canadian curriculum.
In Chapter 2, Scott describes the state's need for a standard official language. He writes, "The great cultural barrier imposed by a separate language is perhaps the most effective guarantee that a social world, easily accessible to insiders, will remain opaque to outsiders. A distinct language is a powerful basis for autonomy. It is also the bearer of a distinct history, a cultural sensibility, a literature, a mythology, a musical past. In this respect, a unique language represents a formidable obstacle to state knowledge, let alone colonization, control, manipulation, instruction, or propaganda." With this idea in mind, the linguistic centralization pursued by Canada in residential schools was a logical, even essential step towards consolidating control over the Indigenous segment of the population. Through linguistic conversion, Indigenous citizens became legible to the state because they became part of a homogenized whole that was easier to manage. Many survivors of residential schools recount not only difficulty while they were in the schools, but also when they were old enough to leave and finally return home. For many, the loss of time, language, and cultural traditions prevented them from fully integrating into their original communities. The state had effectively severed many of these ties.
He got out, like everybody gets out at 16. And he eventually made his way to Aguesasne, to his home. And he told me that he couldn't connect with them. He couldn't connect because he couldn't speak the language. He didn't understand the culture.
Scott quotes sociologist Charles Tilley, writing, "In the period of movement from tribute to tax, from indirect rule to direct rule, from subordination to assimilation, states generally worked to homogenize their populations and break down their segmentation by imposing common languages, religions, currencies, and legal systems." The imposition of common language and religion and the mission to homogenize the indigenous population were all parts of the residential schools, as seen in survivors' testimonies. The subtitle of Scott's Seeing Like a State is How Certain Schemes to Improve the Human Condition Have Failed. Residential schools provide a clear example of a government attempting to improve the lives of its citizens by pursuing what it sees as the right path toward civilization and modernization, while tragically having a harmful impact on a significant part of its population. While this framework helps us to understand why Canada may have pursued the policy of residential schools, this tunnel vision of the state fails to explain the diversity, resilience, and strength that remains with Canada's Indigenous population. Scott's ideas about state legibility also do not explain the policies of multiculturalism in Canada, the fact that there are 2 official languages, or the government's launch of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2008, which partly aimed to reaffirm the agency of Canada's Indigenous population. These could be interesting topics for further exploration.